Welcome to my channel.
The mist over the Sutherland Mountains was not the romantic, ethereal veil described in tourist brochures. It was a thick, sodden wool that smelled of wet sheep and impending rheumatism. P.C. Hamish Macbeth stood by the edge of the Andunburn, his long, lanky frame partially obscured by a cluster of dripping rowan trees. In his hand he held a poaching gaff with the easy familiarity of a man who considered the local salmon to be personal acquaintances rather than property of the estate. Beside him, Lugs, a dog of such magnificent ugliness and uncertain lineage that he appeared to be composed entirely of spare parts, let out a low, pessimistic whine. "Wheesht, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his Highland burr soft and rhythmic. "The Lord provides, but he usually expects us to be quiet about the logistics. One quick flick and we'll have a supper that doesn't involve Mrs. Dunn's questionable mutton." Just as a flash of silver darted beneath the peat-stained water, the heavy, discordant roar of a high-performance engine shattered the morning silence. A bright yellow Porsche, looking entirely offensive against the muted greens and greys of the glen, came screaming down the narrow track that led to the old mill. It didn't slow for the potholes. It bounced over them with a mechanical lack of sympathy that made Hamish wince for the suspension. The car screeched to a halt, and out stepped Julian Vane. Vane was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety, a London interior designer who had bought the old mill with the intention of turning it into a minimalist sanctuary for the soul. He was dressed in a white linen suit that was already beginning to succumb to the Scottish damp, and he wore an expression of permanent, aggressive entitlement. "You there, Constable!" Vane shouted, spotting the shock of red hair among the trees. "Is this what passes for a road in this godforsaken bog? I've nearly bitten my tongue 3 times. And I distinctly told the post office that I am not to be disturbed before 10. Hamish slowly straightened, his back, tucking the gaff behind his leg with the practiced grace of a seasoned malingerer. He adjusted his peaked cap and adopted his most vacant bovine expression, the one that suggested his brain was currently occupied by nothing more complex than the price of wool. "Och, good morning to you, Mr. Vane," Hamish drawled, his voice thickening into a slow, deliberate crawl. "The roads are a bit spirited this time of year. It's the frost, you see. It gets into the cracks and expands, much like the human ego, if you'll pardon the metaphor." Vane sneered, flicking an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "Don't get philosophical with me, Macbeth. It's bad enough I have to live among people who still think a peat fire is a luxury. I have guests arriving for my solstice sobriety retreat tomorrow. High flyers from the city. They expect tranquility, not scruffy policemen lurking in the bushes with, what is that behind your leg? A walking stick, sir, Hamish lied smoothly, his eyes wide and innocent. For the gout. It's horrible gout. My father had it, and his father before him. It's damp, you know." Vane let out a huff of pure disdain. "Just see that you keep the local riffraff away from my gates. I'm paying a fortune in council tax, and I expect a certain level of exclusivity. And for heaven's sake, do something about that dog. It looks like a floor rug that survived a house fire." Lugs let out a low, guttural growl that suggested he understood the insult perfectly. "I'll certainly keep an eye out, sir," Hamish said, watching Vane march back to his yellow monstrosity. "Though in Lochdu, exclusivity usually just means the sheep have moved to the next field." The Porsche roared, leaving a plume of blue exhaust hanging in the heavy air. Hamish sighed, looking back at the burn. The salmon was gone, startled by the noise and the arrogance. His stomach gave a treacherous rumble. He had been dodging a call from the station for 2 hours, hoping for a quiet morning of poaching and contemplation. But as he looked up toward the old mill, he saw a raven circling the stone chimney, a dark, ragged silhouette against the grey sky. In the Highlands, ravens were rarely a sign of good news. Hamish felt a familiar sinking sensation in his chest. The peace of Lochdu had been disrupted by Julian Vane's arrival, but as he watched the bird descend, he had the nagging feeling that the disruption was about to become a great deal more permanent. and much more inconvenient for a man who just wanted a nap. The yellow Porsche barely vanished around the bend, its offensive engine note fading into a distant whine when a sudden, sharp scream echoed from the direction of the old mill. It wasn't the sound of a startled bird or the wind catching a chimney flue. It was the raw, high-pitched terror of someone who had just found something they desperately wished they hadn't. Hamish Macbeth sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of a ruined morning. He looked down at Luggs, who had stood up and was now staring toward the mill with ears cocked forward. "Aye, Luggs," Hamish muttered. Adjusting his belt and abandoning all hope of a salmon supper, that'll be Mr. Vane discovering that exclusivity doesn't protect you from the unpleasantness of the world. Come along, then. He set off at a steady, long-legged pace, cutting through the damp heather rather than following the winding track. By the time he reached the courtyard of the old mill, Julian Vane was leaning against the stone wall, his face a shade of grey that almost matched the Sutherland sky. The white linen suit was now hopelessly stained with mud where he had stumbled, and he was pointing a trembling finger toward the massive oak door of the converted barn. Inside, Vane wheezed, his arrogance having evaporated into a cold sweat. "I went in to check the lighting for the meditation room, and there, hanging, it's ghastly, Macbeth, simply ghastly." Hamish didn't rush. Experience had taught him the dead were rarely rushed. He entered the mill, his eyes instantly adjusting to the dim, cool interior. Vane had spent thousands trying to make the place look ancient yet expensive, with exposed beams and polished slate floors, but the centerpiece of the room was now something entirely unintended. Suspended from a central beam, right above a circular rug designed for Zen contemplation, was a body. It was a man, thin to the point of emaciation, dressed in a ragged army surplus jacket. He wasn't hanging by the neck, however. In a bizarre and humiliating twist, the man had been hoisted up by his own belt, which was looped over a hook, leaving him dangling like a macabre puppet with his toes just inches from the floor. His head was lolling forward, but it wasn't the hanging that had killed him. There was a small, neat puncture wound at the base of his skull, and his face was frozen in a mask of glassy-eyed vacancy. Hamish stepped closer, careful to avoid the pristine slate floor as much as possible. He recognized the man instantly. It was Tommy the Needle McIsaac, a tragic drifting soul from the neighbouring village who had spent the better part of a decade chasing shadows and substances. Tommy was a known addict, a man who would steal the copper piping from his own mother's house for a fix, but he was also a man who lacked the coordination to hang himself in such a theatrical fashion. "Oh, poor Tommy," Hamish whispered. He knelt down, observing the scene with a sharp, predatory focus that he never allowed the likes of Julian Vane to see. There was a strange smell in the air, not the metallic tang of blood or the mustiness of the mill, but something sweet and cloying like burnt sugar or cheap perfume. Near Tommy's dangling feet lay a single, crushed lavender sprig. Hamish stood up, his gaze sweeping the room. There were no signs of a struggle. The minimalist furniture was undisturbed. It looked as though Tommy had simply been placed there, a piece of human refuse discarded in Vane's sanctuary to make a point. Is he dead?" Vane's voice drifted in from the doorway, sounding small and petulant. "As a doornail, Mr. Vane," Hamish replied, his voice flat. He walked back to the door, pulling his notebook from his pocket with a slow, deliberate movement. "And I'm afraid you've got a bit of a problem. This isn't just a trespasser, this is a murder, and a very messy one at that. I'll have to call it in." "A murder in my retreat?" Vane shrieked, his panic returning. "But my guests, the media. You have to move him, Macbeth. Hide him in the woods or something. I can't have a dead junkie hanging in my meditation hall." Hamish looked at Vane with a flash of genuine distaste before masking it with his usual vacant stare. "Move a body, sir. Mercy, that's a serious crime. The chief inspector would have my head on a platter. No, we must wait for the professionals. Though I suspect DCI Blair will be in a very foul mood when he hears he has to drive all the way out here in the rain." Hamish stepped outside, breathing in the clean, damp air to clear the sweet scent from his lungs. He knew what was coming. Blair would arrive like a whirlwind of incompetence, shouting at everyone and probably arresting the first local he saw with a dirty fingernail. He looked at Luggs, who was sniffing the tires of the yellow Porsche. "Well, Luggs," Hamish said softly, "it seems Tommy McIsaac has finally found a place where he can't be ignored. The question is, why would anyone go to the trouble of hanging a dead addict in a place like this? It's not just murder, it's a message. And I have a feeling the sender is someone who knows this village much better than our friend Mr. Vane." The sound of a distant siren began to wail, echoing through the glen like a warning. The peace of Loch Dhu was officially over, and Hamish's long, quiet day had turned into a hunt for a killer who had a very dark sense of irony. He leaned against his Land Rover, waiting for the storm of Blair's arrival, his mind already turning over the lavender and the sweet smell in the air. The wail of the sirens grew into a piercing crescendo, echoing off the steep granite walls of the glen until the sound seemed to come from the mountains themselves. 2 white police cars, caked in the grey mud of the Sutherland roads, skidded into the old mill's courtyard, narrowly missing Julian Vane's pristine Porsche. From the lead vehicle emerged Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose physical presence was defined primarily by a neck that seemed to have surrendered to his collar and a face that remained a permanent, alarming shade of boiled beetroot. He slammed the car door with enough force to make Luggs jump and immediately began barking orders at D.S. Anderson and D.C. McNabb, who trailed behind him looking like weary shadows. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice cutting through the damp Highland air like a rusty saw. He marched toward Hamish, his boots crunching aggressively on the gravel. "I might have known I'd find you standing about like a decorative garden ornament while a crime scene goes to pot. What have you done? Have you trampled all the evidence? Or were you just waiting for the body to get up and walk away?" Hamish smoothed his face into a mask of placid, almost irritatingly slow obedience. He touched the brim of his cap with a lazy finger. "I've stayed well back, sir. Just kept the area secure and comforted Mr. Vane here, who's had a bit of a shock to his system. The body's inside, sir. It's poor Tommy McIsaac." "McIsaac? That pathetic needle-pusher?" Blair sneered, wiping a smear of rain from his forehead. He didn't wait for a briefing. He shoved past Julian Vane and stomped into the mill. Hamish followed at a respectful, languid distance, watching as Blair took in the sight of Tommy dangling from the hook. The DCI didn't look for clues. He looked for the easiest possible explanation that would allow him to get back to the warmth of the Strathbane station. "Right," Blair grunted, pointing a stubby finger at the swinging corpse. "Clear cut. Overdose or remorse. The junkie crawled in here, found a bit of rope, or a belt in this case, and decided to end his miserable existence in a posh setting. Probably did it to spite the Sassenach owner. It's an open and shut suicide, Anderson. Get the photographer here and call the van. I want to be home by supper." "Actually, sir," Hamish said softly, his voice barely a murmur in the cavernous room, "there's a wee puncture wound at the base of his skull, and the belt is tied in a very particular knot, a sheepshank, I believe. Tommy couldn't tie his own shoelaces on a good day, let alone a nautical knot while hanging from a ceiling." Blair turned, his eyes bulging. "Are you telling me how to conduct a death investigation, Macbeth? You're a village bobby who spends his time chasing stray sheep and poaching the laird's salmon. I say it's suicide. The wound is probably a scratch from a needle or a fall, and as for the knot, maybe he had a sudden burst of competence before he kicked the bucket." "Of course, sir. You'll be the expert," Hamish drawled, his eyes wandering toward the circular Zen rug. "It's just that there's no chair or ladder nearby for him to have climbed up. It's almost as if someone lifted him up there. A very strong person, I'd imagine." Blair's gaze followed Hamish's to the empty space beneath the body. His face darkened from beetroot to a deep, bruised purple. He hated it when Hamish pointed out the obvious, especially when it contradicted his desire for a quick result. He looked around the room, searching for a scapegoat, and his eyes landed on a figure standing near the back entrance. A local handyman named Geordie, who was clutching a toolbox and looking terrified. "You!" Blair shouted, charging toward the man. "What are you doing here? Did you see McIsaac come in, or did you help him on that hook? You've got the muscles for it, don't you?" A big, sturdy Highlander like you could toss a scrawny addict around like a bale of hay." I just came to fix the pipes, sir," Geordie stammered, backing away. "I didn't see anything. I only just arrived." "Likely story," Blair roared. "Anderson, take this man to the car. I want him questioned thoroughly. He probably had a grudge against the junkie for stealing his tools. It's a local feud. I can smell it. Macbeth, you stay here and guard the perimeter. Don't touch anything, don't think, and for God's sake, don't get in my way." Hamish watched as the innocent Geordie was led away in handcuffs, his boots dragging in the dirt. Blair was already composing the arrest report in his head, satisfied that he had found a local savage to blame for the mess. Hamish, however, remained focused on the cloying sweet scent that lingered near the body, a scent that certainly didn't belong to a handyman or a drifting addict. As Blair stomped back to his car to escape the drizzle, Hamish knelt down and picked up a tiny, almost invisible thread of purple silk snagged on a splinter of the oak door. "Aye, Blair," Hamish whispered to the empty room. "You've got your man, but you've missed the lady, and she smells a lot more expensive than Geordie's pipe tobacco." As the police cars sped away, their tyres flinging wet gravel into the gorse bushes, the silence that returned to the old mill felt heavier than before. Hamish stood in the middle of the courtyard, the tiny strand of purple silk tucked safely into his notebook. Julian Vane had retreated inside his sanctuary, presumably to douse himself in expensive cologne and call his lawyers, leaving Hamish alone with the damp mountains and a restless dog. He knew he should be at the station, filling out the endless soul-crushing paperwork that Blair would eventually demand, but the sweet, cloying scent from the barn was still tickling his memory. It wasn't the smell of a meditation retreat, nor was it the smell of a Highland winter. "Come on, lugs," Hamish sighed, whistling low. "Blair's busy making a villain out of poor Geordie, and we're hungry. Let's see who's been buying silk and smelling of burnt sugar." The village of Lochdu sat huddled around the curve of the loch like a group of gossips sharing a secret. Hamish didn't head for the police station. Instead, he made his way to the post office and general store, the unofficial intelligence hub of the county. The air inside was warm and smelled of floor wax, old paper, and Mrs. Kennedy's peppermint creams. Mrs. Kennedy herself was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the tip of her nose as she sorted through a stack of circulars with a speed that suggested she was memorizing the return addresses. "I heard the sirens, Hamish Macbeth," she said without looking up. "A body at the mill and Geordie being hauled off in cuffs. I suppose Blair thinks a man who can fix a leaking U-bend is naturally inclined to murder." Hamish leaned against the counter, his face settling into a look of weary, harmless confusion. "Aye, Mrs. Kennedy, the DCI has a very tidy mind. He likes his suspects to be local and conveniently sized for a police cell. He's not much for the finer details, like why Tommy McIsaac would be smelling like a Parisian boudoir." Mrs. Kennedy paused, a postcard from Inverness hovering in mid-air, her sharp eyes fixed on Hamish. "Tommy? Smelling perfume? That lad usually smelled of nothing but stale beer and desperation. But now you mention it, there was a package that came through here last week, addressed to one of Mr. Vane's guests, a Mrs. Cynthia St. James. It had a hole in the corner, and the scent nearly knocked me over, like vanilla and scorched caramel. Very high class and very expensive." "Mrs. St. James, is it?" Hamish drawled, his mind clicking through the names Vane had mentioned. "A guest for the sobriety retreat? A guest who doesn't look like she's ever had a sober day in her life," Mrs. Kennedy chirped, leaning forward. "She's staying at the hotel until the mill is spiritually prepared. A tall, thin woman with hair the colour of a bruised plum and a temper to match. She was in here yesterday complaining that we didn't stock her particular brand of Turkish cigarettes. She's got a scarf, Hamish, a long flowing thing made of purple silk. She nearly strangled herself with it when the wind caught it outside." Hamish nodded, a slow, thoughtful movement. "And what would a lady like that have to do with a poor soul like Tommy? That's for you to find out, isn't it? But I did hear from Nellie at the hotel that Mrs. St. James was seen walking by the burn late last night. She wasn't alone either. There was a man with her, scruffy, according to Nellie. She thought it was a poacher, but it could well have been your Tommy. Hamish thanked her and accepted a ginger nut biscuit, which he shared with Lugs as they stepped back out into the drizzle. The plot was thickening, and it was taking a distinctly aristocratic shape. He headed toward the Lochdu Hotel, his stomach giving a loud, insistent growl. He needed more than a biscuit. He needed a sounding board. And in Lochdu there was only one person who understood the complex, often lethal social dynamics of the upper class better than he did. As he approached the hotel, a grand stone building overlooking the harbour, he saw a silver Bentley parked crookedly near the entrance. It was a vehicle that screamed old money and new arrogance. Hamish slipped through the kitchen door, hoping to avoid the manager and find a pot of coffee. Instead, he found Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was looking as elegant as ever in a tweed jacket, but her brow was furrowed as she looked at a guest register. "Hamish," she said, her eyes lighting up with a mixture of relief and amusement. "I heard you had a busy morning. Blair has been shouting at the staff for the last 20 minutes, demanding to know Geordie's criminal history. I told him Geordie's only crime was being too honest for his own good. Aye, Blair is a force of nature," Hamish said, reaching for a clean mug. "But tell me, Priscilla, what do you know about Mrs. Cynthia St. James? She seems to have a fondness for purple silk and very expensive, very sweet perfume." Priscilla's expression shifted to one of guarded interest. "Cynthia? She's a nightmare draped in Dior, Hamish, but she's also a woman with a very dark past. She was involved in a scandal in London a few years ago, something to do with a missing inheritance and a very convenient accident." "Why do you ask?" "Because," Hamish said, taking a long sip of the hot, bitter coffee, "I found a piece of her scarf on a dead man's door, and I have a feeling that Tommy McIsaac didn't die for a fix. He died because he saw something that wasn't on the retreat's itinerary." Priscilla set the guest register down with a sharp, definitive click, her eyes remaining fixed on Hamish as he leaned against the heavy oak counter. The kitchen was quiet for the moment, the usual clatter of lunch preparations dampened by the thick mist pressing against the window panes. "If Cynthia St. James is involved," Priscilla said, her voice dropping to a cautious undertone, "you're dealing with a woman who treats social reputation as a blood sport. She's here for Julian's retreat because her family's lawyers practically insisted on a period of discreet reflection after the London business. But Cynthia doesn't reflect, Hamish. She retaliates." Hamish took another slow sip of his coffee, the warmth finally reaching his fingers. And what would a woman who treats reputation like a sport want with a poor creature like Tommy McIsaac? He was barely a ghost in his own life, Priscilla. He had nothing to give and even less to lose. Perhaps it wasn't about what he had, but what he found, Priscilla mused, walking over to the window and looking out at the silver Bentley. Tommy spent his nights wandering. He knew every bolt hole and hidden crawl space in this glen. If Julian Vane has been using the old mill for more than just minimalist meditation, Tommy is exactly the sort of person who would have stumbled upon it. And Cynthia, well, she's always been Julian's most silent and most dangerous partner. Hamish nodded, his mind drifting back to the lavender sprig and the sheepshank knot. It was a sophisticated kind of murder, one that required both physical strength and a cold, calculating detachment. He looked at Priscilla, noting the way her refined features sharpened when she focused on a problem. She was his most reliable sounding board, providing a bridge between his local intuition and the impenetrable world of the Sassenach elite. "I need to see her room," Hamish said suddenly, before Blair finishes his interrogation of Geordie and decides to inspect the hotel. "If I can find the rest of that purple scarf, I might have enough to make the DCI look somewhere other than the village handyman." Priscilla hesitated, her sense of propriety warring with her desire for justice. "It's highly irregular, Hamish. If Mr. Johnson, the manager, catches you, he'll report you to the chief constable for harassment, and Cynthia is currently holding court in the residence lounge, waiting for her midday gin." "Ugh, I'll be as quiet as a Highland fox," Hamish promised, adopting his most harmless, sheepish grin. "Lugs can watch the stairs. He's very good at looking pathetic when people try to pass him." They moved through the service corridor, the air growing colder as they left the warmth of the kitchen. Priscilla led him up the back staircase to the second floor, where the most expensive suites were located. The hallway was hushed, the thick carpets muffling their footsteps. At room 24, Priscilla paused, checking the corridor before nodding to Hamish. She didn't have a key, but she knew the hotel's quirks. The old Victorian locks were more decorative than functional if you knew which way to lean against the frame. The door yielded with a faint groan. Inside, the room was a riot of expensive chaos. Half-unpacked suitcases spilled silk dresses and cashmere sweaters across the bed, and the air was thick with the scent Mrs. Kennedy had described, the heavy, cloying smell of vanilla and burnt sugar. Hamish moved quickly, his eyes scanning the dresser. There, draped carelessly over a chair, was a long, flowing scarf of purple silk. He stepped toward it, his heart hammering a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He pulled the small fragment he had found at the mill from his notebook and held it up. The color was an exact match, but as he reached out to examine the edge of the scarf for a tear, his gaze fell on a small leather-bound diary tucked into the side pocket of an open handbag. "Hamish, hurry," Priscilla whispered from the doorway. "I hear the elevator." He ignored the diary for a moment, focusing on the scarf. He found the tear, a jagged triangular gap near the fringe. It was the physical proof he needed, but it wasn't the motive. He reached for the diary, opening it to the most recent entry. The handwriting was sharp and jagged, reflecting its owner's personality. One sentence stood out, written in bold, aggressive strokes. "The local vermin has found the cache. Jay is panicked, but I will handle the disposal. Remnants of the past must remain buried." The sound of voices approached from the hallway, the sharp clipped tones of a woman and the submissive murmur of a waiter. Hamish shoved the fragment back into his notebook, grabbed a single discarded cigarette butt from the ashtray, a brand Mrs. Kennedy hadn't stocked, and slipped out the door just as the elevator gates clattered open at the far end of the hall. "Well?" Priscilla asked as they hurried back down the stairs. "I found the scarf," Hamish said, his voice grim, "and I think I found why Tommy was hanging in that barn. It wasn't about drugs, Priscilla, it was about the cash. Whatever Julian Vane is hiding in that mill, it was worth more than Tommy's life. And what about Geordie?" "Geordie is Blair's prize for now," Hamish said, looking out at the mist. "But I think it's time I went mooching for a bit more than coffee. I need to find out what Tommy was disposing of before the lady with the purple scarf finds me." Hamish left the hotel by the side entrance, the cool, damp air a welcome relief after the suffocating perfume of room 24. Priscilla's warning lingered in his mind like the persistent Highland mist. Cynthia St. James was not a woman to be trifled with, and Julian Vane's minimalist sanctuary was looking more like a fortress for secrets with every passing hour. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from behind a stone planter looking thoroughly bored with the lack of action. The dog's wet nose nudged Hamish's hand, a silent request for a direction, and Hamish knew exactly where the next thread of the mystery would lead. If Tommy had found a cache, he wouldn't have kept it to himself. He would have taken it to the one man in Lochdu who dealt in things that were better left forgotten. He made his way toward the edge of the village, where the houses thinned out and the moor began its long, heather-clad ascent. Tucked away in a hollow near the old bridge was a shack that looked as though it were being slowly reclaimed by the earth. This was the home of old Angus, a man who had spent 60 years beachcombing, scavenging and occasionally acquiring items of uncertain provenance. If Tommy Mac Isaac had found something valuable or something dangerous, he would have brought it here to see if it could be turned into the price of a bottle. "Angus, are you in there, or have the fairies finally taken you?" Hamish shouted, ducking his head as he pushed open the creaking wooden door. The interior was a chaotic museum of Highland detritus, rusted anchors, tangled fishing nets, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. Angus sat by a small peat fire, his face as weathered as a piece of driftwood. He looked up, his one good eye squinting at Hamish. "Och, it's the law. Come to arrest me for the crime of being old and smelling of seaweed, have you?" Hamish pulled up a stool that looked dangerously unstable and sat down. "Not today, Angus. I'm looking for something Tommy Macbeth might have brought you. Something from the old mill. Something that made a lady in a purple scarf very cross." Angus went still, his hand hovering over a pot of tea that smelled of wood smoke and something much stronger. "Tommy's dead, Hamish. I heard the news from the postie. A terrible way to go, hanging like a side of beef in that Sassenach's barn." He sighed, reaching into a crate beside his chair and pulling out a small, heavy object wrapped in a dirty rag. "He brought me this 2 nights ago. Said he found a whole crate of them hidden behind a false wall in the mill's cellar. He thought it was gold. I told him it was just trouble." Hamish unwrapped the rag. Inside was a heavy silver-plated trophy cup, tarnished by age but still magnificent. He turned it over and read the inscription. "The St. James Cup, 1922. Below it, a set of initials had been crudely scratched out, as if someone had tried to erase the history of the object. "Gold it isn't," Hamish murmured, his mind racing. "But it's an inheritance, the missing inheritance Priscilla mentioned." "There's more than just cups in that mill, Hamish," Angus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tommy said the whole cellar was packed with crates, paintings, silver, jewellery. It's a hoard, man, a hoard of stolen history. And that Vane fellow isn't here for meditation, he's here to move the goods before the London police catch up with him." Suddenly the sound of a heavy engine rumbled outside the shack. Lugs let out a sharp, warning bark. Hamish stood up, slipping the silver cup into the deep pocket of his greatcoat. He peered through the Grime Street window and saw the silver Bentley. Cynthia St. James was stepping out, her purple scarf fluttering like a warning flag in the wind. She wasn't looking at the scenery, she was looking directly at Angus's door, and she was holding a heavy silver-topped walking stick with the grip of someone who knew how to use it as a weapon. "She's here for the cup, Angus," Hamish whispered, "and she won't be mooching for tea." He knew he couldn't be caught here. If Cynthia found the village constable in possession of her family's stolen silver, Blair would have his badge, and Geordie would be on his way to a life sentence. He gestured for Angus to stay quiet and slipped out the back door, melting into the shadows of the peat stack, just as the front door was kicked open with a violence that shook the fragile walls of the shack. "Where is it, you old scavenger?" Cynthia's voice rang out, cold and sharp as a Highland frost. "The boy said he brought it here. Give it to me, or I'll have this hovel burned to the ground with you inside it." Hamish didn't stay to hear the rest. He moved through the heather, his heart pounding. The cash was the motive, and Tommy's murder was the cover-up. But as he reached the safety of the main road, he saw another police car heading toward the mill. Blair was back, and he looked like a man who had finally lost his patience. The red herring of Geordie was about to be replaced by a full-scale assault on the village's peace, and Hamish realized that his trap had to be set before the DCI ruined everything. Hamish kept low, his long strides carrying him through the thickening mist with the silence of a ghost. Behind him, the muffled shouts of Cynthia St. James continued to echo from Angus's shack, but he didn't look back. The silver cup in his pocket felt like a cold, heavy anchor. He knew he had the physical evidence of the motive, but the identity of the person who had actually hoisted Tommy Macbeth onto that hook remained the final elusive piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just about strength, it was about the knot. A sheep-shank knot was the hallmark of someone who worked with ropes, someone who understood the tension of the sea or the heavy lifting of the farm. As he reached the shelter of a stone dike, he saw DCI Blair's car screeching toward the old mill for the 3rd time that day. Blair was clearly finished with Geordie and was likely returning to the mill to find a new target for his frustration. Hamish realized that the Solstice sobriety retreat was a perfect front for a massive smuggling operation. Julian Vane provided the location and the wealthy clientele to act as cover, while Cynthia St. James provided the stolen inventory from her family's disputed estates. But Tommy MacIsaac, in his desperate search for something to sell, had stumbled upon the false wall and threatened to bring the whole gilded house of cards crashing down. "But it wasn't Cynthia who tied that knot, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the lights of the mill flicker in the distance. "She has the temper and the motive, but those hands of hers have never done a day's hard labour. And Julian Vane is too much of a coward to touch a corpse, let alone lift one." He began to walk toward the hotel, his mind sorting through the faces of the village. He needed to find out who had been helping Vane with the old mill renovations before Geordie took the job. He remembered a detail from Mrs. Kennedy, the mention of a scruffy man seen with Cynthia by the burn. It hadn't been Tommy. Tommy was scruffy, yes, but he was also frail. The person Nellie had seen must have been the muscle. He entered the hotel kitchen again, finding it empty this time. He helped himself to a cold sausage from a plate on the side, chewing thoughtfully. His gaze fell upon a local newspaper on the table, a few weeks old. There, in a small corner, was a photo of the redevelopment team at the old mill. Standing next to a smiling Julian Vane was a man Hamish hadn't seen in months, Fergus the Hulk McLean. Fergus was a former merchant seaman who had been kicked out of the service for his violent temper and a penchant for liberating cargo. He was a man who knew his way around a rope, and more importantly, a man who would do anything for a woman like Cynthia if the price was right. The realization hit Hamish with the force of a Highland gale. Fergus was the muscle, but he was also the weak link. He was a man of simple greeds and even simpler loyalties. If Hamish could make Fergus believe that Cynthia was planning to leave him behind to take the fall, the man would crumble. But he had to act fast. Blair was already at the mill, and if the DCI found the crates first, he would arrest everyone in sight, including the witnesses Hamish needed. "I need to set a rumour adrift, Lugs," Hamish said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "A rumour about a certain silver cup and a lady who's planning to fly back to London tonight with all the profit." He made his way to the residence lounge, staying in the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. He could see Cynthia St. James sitting by the fire, her face a mask of cold fury as she checked her watch. She looked like a woman waiting for a signal. Hamish didn't approach her. Instead, he found the hotel's young porter, a lad named Davy who was a notorious gossip and always eager for a bit of excitement. "Davy," Hamish whispered, beckoning the boy into the hallway, "do me a favour. Go to the kitchen and mention quite loudly that you saw the village constable carrying a silver cup toward Fergus McLean's cottage, and say that you heard the lady in the purple scarf is planning to tell the police that Fergus acted alone in the unfortunate accident at the mill." Davy's eyes widened. "Is that true, Hamish?" "In Lochdu, Davy, the truth is whatever people repeat the most," Hamish said with a wink. "Now off you go. The faster that news travels, the sooner we can all get some sleep." He watched the boy scurry away, knowing that within 20 minutes the news would reach Fergus. The trap was set. All Hamish had to do was wait for the fear to do its work. He stepped back out into the night, the silver cup still heavy in his pocket, heading for the old mill one last time. The confrontation was coming, and he had to be there to catch the pieces before Blair smashed them. The mist had thickened into a damp, suffocating shroud. As Hamish approached the old mill, the light from his torch struggling to pierce the gloom. He didn't take the main track, where Blair's police car sat like a brooding sentinel, its blue lights occasionally pulsing against the stone walls of the barn. Instead, he kept to the high ground, moving through the sodden heather with Lugs trailing silently behind. He knew Davy's gossip would have reached Fergus McLean's ears by now. In a small village like Lochdu, fear travelled faster than a Highland gale, and a man like Fergus, strong in body but weak in nerve, would be spiralling into a panic. Hamish crouched behind a stack of seasoned timber near the back entrance of the mill. From this vantage point, he could see the silhouette of the barn door, hanging slightly ajar. Inside, He could hear the muffled, frantic sounds of someone moving heavy objects. It wasn't the rhythmic stomp of Blair's boots, it was the hurried, desperate scraping of wood on slate. The cache was being moved. Fergus, fearing Cynthia's betrayal and the looming shadow of the gallows, was trying to secure his share of the stolen loot before the lady in the purple scarf could vanish back to the city. "He's taking the bait, lugs," Hamish whispered, his voice barely a breath. "He thinks he's being clever, but he's just digging his own hole." Suddenly, the silence of the courtyard was shattered by the sharp click of heels on stone. Cynthia St. James emerged from the shadows of the side garden, her purple scarf whipping around her neck like a predatory snake. She wasn't alone. Julian Vane followed her, looking like a man who had finally realized that his minimalist sanctuary had become a crime scene. Cynthia marched straight to the barn door and shoved it open, her face a mask of aristocratic ice. "Fergus, you lumbering idiot," she hissed, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "What do you think you're doing? I told you to stay at the cottage until I sent it to you. Do you want the police to find you standing over the crates?" A shadow came loose from inside the barn. Fergus the Hulk McLean stepped into the faint light, his massive shoulders hunched and his face twisted with suspicion. In his hand he held a length of heavy nautical rope, the same kind used to tie the sheep-shank knot that had sealed Tommy McIsaac's fate. "The boy Davy said you're pinning it on me, Cynthia," Fergus growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Said the copper's got the silver cup and you're planning to tell Blair I did the boy and myself." "I did the lifting for you and I did the hanging to make it look like a message. But I won't hang for you in Strathbane. Don't be a fool," Cynthia snapped, though Hamish noticed she took a wary step back. "The boy is a village gossip. You know how these peasants love to stir trouble. I'm the only one who can get this inventory to London. If you kill me, you'll be left with a pile of silver you can't sell and a murder charge you can't escape. Julian's the one who panicked," Fergus shouted, pointing a thick finger at the trembling Vane. "He said Tommy saw too much through the cellar window. He told me to handle it. I only did what I was told." Hamish stayed perfectly still, his mind recording every word. The trap had worked better than he had hoped. The tension between London greed and local muscle had finally snapped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy police whistle, but he didn't blow it yet. He needed them to move toward the crates, to reveal the physical location of the cache so Blair couldn't claim it was all just a misunderstanding. "The crates are behind the false wall in the meditation room, aren't they, Julian?" Cynthia asked, her voice dropping to a deadly honeyed tone. "Let's just check that everything is secure before we decide who's staying and who's going. If the cup is missing, we have a problem." As the three of them turned to enter the mill, Hamish rose from behind the timber stack. He knew he had to be careful. Fergus was a violent man, and Cynthia was desperate. He whistled once, a sharp, high note that signalled lugs to circle around to the front. It was time to stop being the lazy copper and start being the law. He stepped into the doorway of the barn, the silver cup held firmly in his hand like a trophy of his own. "I believe you're looking for this, Fergus," Hamish said, his voice ringing out with a cold, clear authority that made all three of them freeze. "And I believe DCI Blair is just around the corner, looking for someone to blame for a very messy hanging. It seems you've all been very busy for a sobriety retreat." Cynthia spun around, her eyes flashing with a murderous light. You scruffy little man. You think you can stop us with a bit of tarnished silver? I don't need to stop you, Miss Cynthia," Hamish drawled, slipping back into his slow Highland lilt as he heard the heavy footsteps of Blair approaching from the front. "I just need to keep you talking until the real professionals arrive." The heavy silence of the barn was punctured by the sound of Julian Vane's teeth chattering, a frantic, rhythmic clicking that seemed to irritate Cynthia more than the presence of the law. She glared at Hamish, her hand tightening around the silver handle of her walking stick. Fergus, however, didn't look at the stick or the trembling designer. His eyes were fixed on the silver cup in Hamish's hand, his breathing coming in ragged, bovine heaves. The former seaman was a cornered animal, and as the distant slam of a car door echoed from the front of the mill, signalling Blair's lumbering approach. Fergus realized his time for a quiet escape had vanished. "Give me the cup, Macbeth," Fergus growled, taking a heavy, thudding step forward. The length of rope in his hand whipped through the air with a sinister hiss. "You've played your little games, but I'm the one who knows how to tie a knot that stays tight. If I'm going down, I'm not going alone, and I'm certainly not going empty-handed." Hamish didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his long, lanky frame relaxed in a way that hid the coiled tension in his muscles. "Oh, Fergus, you were always a man of great strength and very little sense. You've let a lady who wouldn't look at you twice turn you into a common murderer. Tommy was a poor soul, but he was a Loch Dour soul, and we don't take kindly to our own being hung up like Highland venison." "Lynch him, Fergus!" Cynthia shrieked, her aristocratic composure finally shattering into a jagged mess of desperation. "He's alone! Get the cup and get to the Bentley! We can still make the coast!" Fergus lunged. For a man of his size, he moved with a surprising, deceptive speed born of years on pitching decks. He swung the weighted end of the nautical rope toward Hamish's head. Hamish, however, had spent a lifetime dodging more than just work. He had the reflexes of a man who frequently had to outrun angry gamekeepers. He ducked, the rope whistling mere inches above his peaked cap, and stepped into Fergus's guard. With a sharp, practiced movement, Hamish used the heavy silver cup as a makeshift knuckle duster, catching Fergus squarely in the solar plexus. The big man let out a wheeze of exhaled air and doubled over, but his momentum carried him forward. Hamish tripped him with a well-placed boot, sending Fergus sprawling onto the polished slate floor. Before the giant could recover, Hamish whistled, a sharp, piercing note that echoed off the rafters. Lugs, who had been waiting for the signal, burst through the side door with a ferocious, snarling energy that seemed entirely at odds with his usual lethargy. The dog didn't bite, but he threw his considerable weight against Cynthia's knees, sending the lady in the purple scarf tumbling into a stack of minimalist meditation cushions. "Stop! Everyone stay exactly where you are!" DCI Blair burst through the main entrance, his face a shade of violet that suggested he was moments away from a medical emergency. Behind him, Anderson and McNabb followed with their batons drawn, looking confused but eager to hit something. Blair's eyes swept the room, taking in the groaning Fergus, the dishevelled Cynthia, the sobbing Julian Vane, and Hamish Macbeth, who was calmly dusting off his uniform. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice shaking the very beams of the old mill. "What the hell is going on here? I told you to stay on edge. Why is the suspect, the only suspect, Geordie, still in my car while you're here having a wrestling match with the gentry?" Hamish looked at Blair with an expression of wide-eyed, vacant helpfulness. "Och, sir, you've arrived just in time. It was a terrible thing. I came to check the back door as you ordered, and I found these three moving the evidence. It seems poor Fergus here has a very guilty conscience. He's just been confessing to everything, the hanging of Tommy, the stolen silver, the lot. I think he was trying to protect Mr. Vane and the lady, but the pressure of your brilliant interrogation of Geordie must have broken him." Blair blinked, his brain struggling to process the shift in the narrative. He looked at the false wall, which had been partially pried open during the struggle, revealing the glint of more silver and the corner of an ornate picture frame. The DCI's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a man who saw a headline in the making. Confessing, was he? Blair puffed out his chest, stepping over Fergus's prone form to inspect the hidden cash. "I knew it. I knew the Geordie angle was just a lead-in to something bigger, a smuggling ring, a Highland heist. Anderson, get the cuffs on everyone, especially the big one. Macbeth, you've managed to stumble onto my trap perfectly. I'll be taking the credit for this. I'll be taking the lead on the reporting." "Of course, sir," Hamish drawled, his voice a smooth, submissive crawl. "It was all your doing. I was just the bait, I suppose you could say. I'll just go and see about a pot of tea. My nerves are quite shot." The following hour was a whirlwind of frantic activity, most of it involving DCI Blair shouting into his radio and striking heroic poses for a non-existent news camera. The old mill was no longer a sanctuary for the soul. It was a brightly lit hub of forensic chaos. Searchlights cut through the mist, illuminating the courtyard as Anderson and McNabb began the laborious process of cataloguing the treasure trove found behind the false wall. There were Dutch masters, Georgian silverware, and boxes of emeralds that had been reported stolen from a London auction house 6 months prior. Fergus McLean was hauled away in the back of a van, his spirit broken and his mouth wide open, spilling every detail of Cynthia's involvement in an attempt to save his own neck. Julian Vane was weeping into a silk handkerchief, while Cynthia St. James sat in the back of a patrol car, her purple scarf draped around her like a funeral shroud, staring at Hamish with eyes that promised a very expensive revenge. Hamish stood on the periphery of the light, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. He felt the weight of the silver cup, which he had quietly handed back to McNabb to be tagged as evidence. He looked at Luggs, who was currently sniffing a discarded sandwich wrapper near the police cars. The dog looked up, his tail giving a single tired thump against the wet gravel. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, replaced by a deep, hollow ache in Hamish's stomach that reminded him he hadn't eaten anything substantial since a stolen sausage 3 hours ago. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, emerging from the barn with a silver-plated teapot in one hand and a look of immense self-satisfaction on his face. "I've just spoken to the chief constable. He's ecstatic. This is the biggest recovery in a decade. He's already talking about praise. I told him how I'd been tracking this ring since they left London, and how I used the local station as a focal point for the sting." "A masterstroke, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into its most admiring, sycophantic tone. "To think you let Geordie be arrested just to lull the real killers into a false sense of security. It's the kind of strategic thinking they don't teach in the academy. I'm just glad I didn't ruin your plan by being too competent." Blair's face glowed with a radiance that had nothing to do with the searchlights. "Yes, well, it takes experience, Macbeth. Something you'll never have if you stay in this backwater. But I suppose you're happy here, playing at being a policeman while the real work gets done in Strathbane. I'll see that your name is mentioned in the footnotes of the report. Officer present or something of the sort." "That would be more than enough, sir," Hamish drawled, touching his cap. "In fact, if you could make it even more vague, I'd appreciate it. I wouldn't want the village folk thinking I was becoming a high flyer. It ruins the rapport, you see." Blair snorted, already turning back to bark a new set of orders at his weary team. He didn't see the flicker of intelligence in Hamish's eyes, nor did he realize that he had just been handed a promotion that would keep him far away from Lochdu for a very long time. Hamish watched as the convoy of police vehicles finally began to pull out of the courtyard, the sirens silent now, leaving the old mill to return to the shadows and the mountains. The walk back to the village was long and quiet. The mist had begun to lift, revealing a sliver of a moon hanging over the loch. As Hamish reached the police station, he saw a light in the window of the hotel kitchen. He knew Priscilla would be there, waiting for the final word on the night's events. He stopped for a moment, looking at his small whitewashed station. It was cold, and the fire would need rebuilding, but it was his. There would be no transfer to Glasgow, no desk job in Inverness, and no more solstice sobriety retreats to disrupt the peace. He let himself in, the familiar smell of peat and old wool welcoming him home. He moved to the small stove and set a pot of water to boil. Luggs settled onto his rug with a sigh of profound relief, his paws twitching as he returned to his dreams of chasing rabbits. Hamish sat at the table, the morning paper from 3 days ago still lying there, a reminder of a time before Tommy McIsaac had become a message on a hook. "Justice is a messy business, Luggs," Hamish whispered as he poured himself a mug of coffee. "But as long as Blair is happy with his medals and the Sassenachs are back in their cells, I think we can call it a day." He leaned back, closing his eyes as the warmth of the coffee spread through him. The village of Lochdu was quiet once more, its secrets tucked back under the heather and the stone, and PC Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he wanted to be, alone, unpromoted, and very, very lazy. The steam from the coffee mug rose in a delicate swirling pillar, mingling with the faint blue mist of the peat fire Hamish had finally coaxed back to life. The police station was quiet, save for the rhythmic, wet snoring of lugs, who had decided that the rug in front of the hearth was the only place in Sutherland worth occupying. Hamish sat with his long legs stretched out toward the heat, his mind finally drifting away from the jagged adrenaline of the mill. He felt the familiar heavy blanket of Highland peace settling over him, a silence so profound that he could hear the tiny metallic pings of the cooling stove. He was nearly asleep when the telephone on his desk let out a sharp, demanding jingle. Hamish stared at it with an expression of profound betrayal. For a moment he considered letting it ring until the caller gave up, but the persistent rhythm suggested someone who knew exactly where he was and wasn't going to be deterred by the hour. With a groan that mirrored his dog's earlier complaints, he stood up and lifted the receiver. "Lochdu Police," he drawled, leaning his shoulder against the wall. "Macbeth?" "I hope I'm not interrupting a nap," came the crisp, unmistakable voice of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. There was a lightness in her tone that usually meant she had spent the last hour observing the fallout of his handiwork. "Oh, Priscilla, I was just filing some internal thoughts," Hamish replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "What's the word from the hotel? Has the DCI finished his victory lap?" "Blair has just left for Strathbane with a police escort that would have been appropriate for a visiting head of state," Priscilla laughed. "He was carrying a silver salver like it was the Holy Grail. He stopped by the bar to announce to anyone who would listen, which at this hour was only the night porter and a very confused sheep farmer, that he had cracked the St. James Syndicate. He didn't mention you once, Hamish. In fact, when someone asked if the local constable had helped, Blair said you were mostly responsible for getting in the way of his forensic sweep." "Good," Hamish said, his voice genuinely relieved. "The more he thinks I'm a hindrance, the safer my job is. If the chief constable thinks I'm the one who found that false wall, I'll be sitting in an office in Inverness before the snow melts. I'm quite happy being a footnote in Blair's autobiography." "Well, you're more than a footnote to the people of Lochdu," Priscilla said, her voice softening. "Geordie was released an hour ago. He came by the hotel to drop off a message for you. He said to tell you that the pipes in your kitchen have been miraculously fixed, and you won't be seeing a bill for it. I suspect you'll have free drams at the pub for the next month as well." Hamish looked at his boots, a faint flush of embarrassment colouring his cheeks. "Geordie's a good lad. He shouldn't have been in that car in the first place. Is it all news? Is Our Lady in the purple scarf safely tucked away?"
"She is."
Though she was still threatening to sue the entire Highlands for aesthetic trauma as they put her in the van. Julian Vane was mostly just concerned about whether they had high thread count sheets in the Strathbane holding cells. "It's a sad business, Hamish. All that stolen history tucked away in a barn just to satisfy a few people's greed." "Aye," Hamish sighed, looking out the dark window at the reflection of the fire. "But Tommy McIsaac is the saddest part. He deserved better than to be a prop in their play. I'll be seeing his mother tomorrow. She'll need a bit of comfort and maybe a few of those scones you were mentioning earlier. I'll bring a fresh batch by the station in the morning," Priscilla promised. "Get some sleep, Hamish. You've earned it, even if you're too stubborn to admit you've done a day's work." Hamish hung up the phone and walked back to his chair. He picked up his coffee, which was now lukewarm, and took a final sip. The mystery was solved, the villains were in transit, and the village was protected by the most effective weapon in the Highlands, the studied incompetence of its only policeman. He looked at Lugs, who opened one eye, looked at the empty mug, and went back to sleep. Hamish followed suit, sinking into the cushions and letting the warmth of the peat fire carry him toward a dreamless, well-earned rest. The sun rose over Lochdu the following morning with a clarity that seemed to apologize for the previous day's gloom. The mist had been chased away by a crisp golden light that turned the loch into a sheet of polished sapphire. In the village, life resumed its rhythmic, unhurried pace. Mrs. Kennedy was busy polishing the brass handle of the post office door, and the local fishermen were down at the quay, mending nets and debating the price of herring as if the St. James Syndicate, had been nothing more than a fever dream brought on by too much local whiskey. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee. Hamish Macbeth, now properly scrubbed and wearing a clean, though slightly frayed uniform, was carefully flipping a pancake on his small stove. Lugg sat by the door, his nose twitching at the savoury aromas, occasionally glancing at the gate in anticipation of a visitor. A light tapping announced Priscilla, who entered carrying a basket of warm scones and a folded copy of the Strathbane Gazette. She set the items on the table and pointed to the front page. "There you are, Hamish, or rather there you aren't," she said with a playful glint in her eyes. The headline screamed, "Blair's Bravery Mastermind of the Mill Captured." Below was a large photograph of DCI Blair, his chest puffed out so far. He looked like a prize pigeon, receiving a symbolic handshake from the chief constable. The article detailed Blair's daring midnight raid and his keen forensic intuition. At the very bottom of the second page, a tiny sentence noted, "A local constable was also on site to assist with animal control." Hamish chuckled, a deep, relaxed sound. "Animal control, is it? Well, Luggs, it seems you're the hero of the hour. I'm just the fellow holding the lead." "It's exactly what you wanted," Priscilla noted, helping herself to a cup of coffee. "Blair is being fast-tracked for a superintendent position in Glasgow. He'll be far too busy attending gala dinners and shouting at city detectives to ever bother us in Lochdu again." "Aye," Hamish sighed contentedly, sitting at the small wooden table. "And with Julian Vane's retreat now tied up in a mountain of legal litigation and evidence bags, the old mill will likely stand empty for another decade. The sheep will have their peace back, and so will I." He looked out the window. The village felt safe, its secrets tucked back under the heather where they belonged. Tommy Mac Isaac had been given a dignified funeral that morning, paid for by an anonymous village fund that everyone knew had come from Hamish's meagre savings. The cash was gone, the greed was punished, and the deceptive laziness of the Highland law had once again proven to be the sharpest blade in the glen. "You know, Hamish," Priscilla said, looking at him over the rim of her mug, "one day you might actually get the recognition you deserve. Someone might realize you're the smartest man in the county." Hamish took a slow, deliberate bite of his pancake, looking horrified at the very thought. "Lord, I hope not, Priscilla. Recognition sounds like a lot of work. I'd much rather be the man who let the DCI think he was a genius while I enjoyed my breakfast in peace." As Priscilla laughed and the fire crackled in the grate, Hamish leaned back, petting Luggs's scruffy head. The world outside could have its scandals, its sirens, and its silver cups. Here, in the quiet heart of Sutherland, PC Hamish Macbeth had everything he needed: a warm hearth, a loyal dog, and the blissful, unearned reputation of being the laziest policeman in Scotland.